every single university needs to have at least one resident thespian. And we have one who's been a wonderful source of energy and vitality for us. And if we ever wanted to know how to do things properly and stage themselves properly, we used Cate Ratcliffe as our example. She speaks clearly, she sings clearly, and she gives a lot more energy. Like she's kind of a little, not little, but she's kind of like this energy thing. She's got this capacity to fill a room just by who she is. And she's got a reasonably hot topic. All the single ladies, Cate, we're in your hands.
No pressure after that intro.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jody.
Got it.
As I'm sure many, hopefully all of you are aware, Christianity has been around for millennia. Despite this long-standing tradition, women in ministry, indeed women actively involved in the workforce in general, is a relatively new phenomenon. The reality is, women are quickly rising up the ranks in both the church and in the secular context. What's particularly interesting in the church context is that many who started out in ministry and were the original pioneers of female ministers did so as a second career or after raising a family. Although there are many that continue to follow that pattern today, we're starting to have a generation of younger women being raised up in the church, some of whom have come almost straight out of school and into ministry. This is not so different from the generations of young men who went into ministry before. And yet this generation of young women is a new phenomenon, one that comes with its own benefits, challenges, and realities. One of the first questions that I'm asked when someone finds out that I'm studying to be a priest, after the comment, "But you're so young," is, "Does this mean you can't get married?" This question has come from friends, family, acquaintances, and even complete strangers. I will preface this by saying that I am not in a serious relationship and have no vision of marriage on the horizon. But apparently just about everyone around me is concerned for the viability of my inevitable impending future nuptials. I have reassured each person who has asked me that, yes, I am young, and yes, I can in fact potentially get married someday. As I've moved through my studies here at the Atlantic School of Theology, and that question has followed me throughout my time here, I've been increasingly curious about what it will be like to be a young woman in ministry, what my supports will be, what dating will be like, and what pressures will be placed upon me. Because of the general demographics here at AST, there were few opportunities for me to discuss these sorts of things or look at them from an academic perspective, which prompted me to examine the question for my grad project: what is the experience of young, single clergywomen? The face of ministry is changing, or at least expanding to encompass a wider range of individuals with a wider range of life experience. And just as the face of ministry, along with that of the church as a whole, is changing, so is secular society, or it has changed significantly in the last few decades. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The predominant secular culture of a couple of generations of youth prior. The free love movement has shifted into things like casual sex, friends with benefits, and other such arrangements, which fall under the umbrella term of the hookup culture. Particularly in the last decade, with the increase in technology, social media, and online dating, the hookup culture has increased. For my research, I focused on women who are in positions of ordained leadership in a congregation, identify as single, and are aged 30 or under, although for anonymity they will be billed as 26 years old, so that they would be of an age that straddles both categories, the world of technology and the world of ordained ministry and life in the church. Each of the participants I interviewed happens to be a pioneer in her own context, either the first female minister or the first young and female minister that her congregation has experienced. I interviewed each one individually via video chat and used hermeneutical phenomenology as my method. For the purposes of anonymity, denominational phrases have been edited out, with terms such as minister and congregation being used across the board. What is the hookup culture? The definition established by Tina Penhallow, Michael Young, and William Bailey in their study about the relationship between religiosity and hooking up behavior is sexual encounters between strangers or brief acquaintances in which there is no anticipation of a continued relationship. They speculate that attitudes regarding premarital sex have become more permissive over time, and that this may be connected to a decline in religious values. Scholar Stephen E. Rhodes notes that the hookup culture has become more of a norm among young people today because women who participate in casual sex make it harder for the majority of women to get dates and committed sex. It has become somewhat of a societal expectation and can therefore be challenging for those who do not wish to engage in premarital sexual encounters to date in the same way as their peers. All of my participants spoke to the reality of the hookup culture and the challenges faced by being someone who is not interested in participating in it. Some comments pertaining to the hookup culture were, before going into ministry, I was scared of the hookup culture and the way things are. I found it very difficult to meet men who would even entertain anything but a hookup approach to dating. The hookup culture I struggle with, really struggle with. I don't get the whole idea. I think sex is something you have with somebody that you have a strong relationship with already. I'm not a fan, but it is reality. One participant told a story about going out with a group of friends, one of whom she thought was cute, and who was being super nice and knew I was Christian and studying to be a minister. He would give me all these Bible quotes and would flirt with me using religion and all this sort of thing. And I thought it was really cute and adorable and fun. So we went for a little walk outside and he kissed me and that was nice. And then he turned around and was like, "Hey, can I come home with you tonight?" And I was like, "Where did you get the impression that that's what I would do?" She remembers being surprised and that I guess I just hadn't experienced that it was considered normal or casual, just like, come on over. It wasn't actually what I was used to. I hope if a person gets to know me enough and really would consider being with me because that's what they know that I want, then they would just not do that or expect that. These young clergywomen are dancing between two worlds, that of their peers and that of their churches. Sometimes the two coincide, and other times there is striking disparity. This is particularly evident in the concept of identity. There are many assumptions made about ministers, particularly by those who are not active church attenders. One participant noted of people who do not often attend church that they really do have the image of the minister being this old, balding white guy. Even within the context of the congregation, they are often seen predominantly, if not solely, in the role of minister. As one participant stated, with some annoyance, there's sometimes this idea where, because I'm a minister, I'm seen more as the office of minister rather than myself. It's kind of like the idea of kids thinking that the teacher lives at school. There's a kind of sense that the minister sort of lives at the church, and in some ways it kind of feels like that. You know, there's kind of this sense that my office is who I am, which I am. I am a minister in that office. But at the same time, there's more to me than just the person who preaches and does funerals and does weddings. Although each of my participants identifies as a minister, and they don't have qualms about fitting into this role, there tends to be a desire to fit into the category of normal people, as one participant put it, liking and being able to discuss topics that pertain to things outside of the church. For many people, particularly those who may not have a strong church background, if and when they think of women with leadership roles in the church, they often think of nuns. This is an entirely different calling. However, sometimes people are unfamiliar with the differentiations between the two. These impressions can extend into the world of dating, and as one particular participant wanted it made clear, I'm not a nun, and we're not breaking the rules by me dating. Scholars Barbara Brown-Zickmund, Adair T. Loomis, and Patricia May-Yin Chang remarked in their research that over 60% of single clergywomen believe that being ordained negatively impacts their intimate relationships for a variety of reasons, including that men are threatened by the thought of dating an ordained woman and the overwhelming demands on their time as clergy. My participants had a wide range of experiences on this, from statements like, "The fact that I studied and I'm a minister now has never been a concern for any man that I've met yet," to, "I knew it was a complete turnoff just to name myself as a minister, and I'm proud of who I am as a minister, but it kind of puts the kibosh on dating," to, "This exotic person to date, kind of almost like a notch you didn't have in your belt." Much of the dating world for my participants seemed to fall into breaking down the barriers and assumed stereotypes of their roles as ministers. Although each participant has experimented with online dating, none of them particularly enjoyed it, nor did they hope that this was where they would meet their potential partner. One participant expressed that her experiences were not always enjoyable, and it was frustrating on both sides, because I would kind of go into it being more naive and not realizing what the expectations were. And then the other person would go into it just assuming that, you're on this dating app, so you're clearly open to the hookup culture and all that goes along with it. This led to what she deemed a discouraging 100 bad first dates. This same participant commented that, on the whole though, I think it comes down to how you approach the apps. I have a number of Christian friends who are women who are on these apps and have found them just much more freeing because everything is so upfront. Another participant commented that in reading people's online dating profiles, it became clear that they're interested in hooking up rather than having a relationship. She stated, "So often, if you read between the lines, that's what it's all about. It's like, I'm a big, muscular guy, and I like to work out a lot, and maybe we could meet up." And the people that you'd constantly get messages from, you could tell that's what they wanted, was just to have sex. And it's like, there's so much more to relationships than sex. No matter what your views on premarital sex are, there's so much more to it. And I find so often when it comes to online dating, it's kind of an unwritten rule that that's what people are there for. Two of my participants in particular talked about the frustrations with having to break the stereotypes associated with ministers while online dating. One participant expressed that it can be exhausting to have to get all of that out of the way before we can talk about Game of Thrones or the new Drake album, to get to the stuff that we can definitely have in common. Because there's the sense that the common ground is the movies, the books, what's going on in the news sort of thing that everybody else talks about too. So having to get it out of the way, trying to get past that is exhausting. The other expressed the challenge that by labeling yourself as a Christian in the 21st century on dating sites, people often get matched with men who hold to a more conservative belief and often weren't affirming of women in ministry or leadership positions. She stated that some of them came around or were like, I'm going to be flexible on this because I think you're a great person, or I want to learn more. But she expressed that in these situations, the onus was still on me to educate them or to present a compelling enough view for them to become affirming of women in ministry, which is, as she put it, just a lot of pressure in a dating relationship when you're trying to do everything else that comes with it. And although none of my participants expressed experiencing this to date, in Ashley Ann Masters and Stacy Smith's chapter entitled Romancing the Reverend, they discuss a single female clergy person feeling like the chaplain of Match.com because of all the pastoral care that resulted when potential matches found out she was a minister. Despite these experiences being discouraging at times, for some, it can be one of the only options. Because ministers spend so much time around congregants, this tends to be one of their main social interactions. All of my participants talked about the taboo on dating congregants, or those connected with the church, a topic that, according to one participant, so many of my mentors had drilled into me. Although it's an important and helpful boundary to consider, the participant expressed that all of this discussion caused her to be hyper-aware, overly cautious, and even awkward when dealing with congregants in the early stages of her ministry. Those who live in rural communities voiced the challenges of even dating within their community, because everyone tends to be quite interconnected. The problem becomes that to get out of your community, the only days you can really do that are if you don't have something else scheduled, say on an evening, or if it's your day off. And even then, if somebody calls that morning and says, so-and-so's dying, please come to the hospital, your day off gets postponed. So it's hard to set up a date. This adds an extra layer of challenge to the dating scene on top of the geographical distance from people who they feel are acceptable to date, which can lead to feelings of isolation. Scholars Zickmund, Loomis, and Chang noted that the challenges that they observe often increase for clergywomen placed in rural congregations, which is a reality many young clergywomen face, and can create a fishbowl effect in many communities. Because rural communities are so small, it's not uncommon for the entire community to experience this fishbowl effect. However, it was particularly addressed by some of my participants in their experience. It was noted that at times, it can feel like being a small-scale celebrity, with one participant noting that people make comments along the lines of, "Oh yes, you're that 26-year-old. I heard about you. I hear lots about you all the time." It's like, oh my gosh, do you guys talk about anything else? And she noted that often people she encounters know more of the information than I do. I don't even remember half the things they mention. This can lead to feelings of frustration, as was expressed in the statement, "Some days I find the expectations and the being in the public light and the lack of privacy really difficult. Some days I wish I was a nobody on the street, or that nobody knew me." Even in the context of urban settings, personal boundaries in the church can be a challenge. One participant noted that it's kind of assumed that my personal life is open for commentary, and that as clergy, people are much more involved and people are more interested. The nature of the work is quite relational, and you share a lot about your personal relationships just in conversations. One participant spoke to this in the sense that people are interested and they want me to be happy in terms of my dating life, but that people stick their noses in a little too far. I understand their concern and their intent, like they want me to be happy, and their intent is really great, but part of me is hesitant because of how much involvement might happen before they get ahead of themselves. Another participant questioned whether or not it's better to keep your private life completely separate, or if there's a benefit to recognizing that working as a minister is just a totally different work environment, and spoke to not knowing what the norm for that would be, or what the expectations of the church would be in that area. People have a tendency to comment on the appearance of clergywomen. One participant spoke to the experience of pressure pertaining to the way that she dresses and acts, and the frustration of having people comment on your appearance rather than, "Your sermon was really interesting this morning." Although she tries to break down these barriers as much as she can, she noted that there are still things that I do as a young clergy that I kind of do to pacify the masses. This pressure can even come across as a violation at times. One participant told a story of her first Sunday in her congregation when someone told her how suited she was for family and children's ministry while visibly looking her up and down. She remembers thinking, "Oh, I feel so violated." This sense that the bodies of young, single clergywomen belong to others for observation and comment certainly makes people feel uncomfortable. One of the biggest issues of being single and in ministry is that of loneliness. As much joy as ministry brings, it can also be an exhausting job. For many single clergy, solace can be sought in friendship outside of the congregation. However, some participants spoke to wanting more. Relationships are about more than the physical side of things, but offering support and helping to hold people accountable. As one participant stated, "I wonder if people take into account how hard it is to be a single clergy and not have that support." She continued, "It's really important for me to spend time with someone, for me to receive hugs. Physical touch is really important, as is thoughtful things like cooking meals or bringing me a coffee. Thoughtful things are comfort when this job is so high stress and busy." And later, this participant lamented, "I give everything to God. I just wish God could send people in my life, or a person in my life, who could give to me." When this partnership is lacking and creates loneliness, this can impact both the well-being of the individual and the well-being of their church as a whole. As pastor and scholar Carolyn A. Crawford states, "For many singles who are in ministry, the fact of being alone leads to loneliness, which can lead to a host of unwanted coping mechanisms to avoid this sentiment. Humans are not intended to be alone or without a support network. As early as the book of Genesis, we see that humans are intended to work together. God even says, 'It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner.' We see in both the Gospel of Mark and Luke that Jesus, in commissioning his disciples to go out in pairs, implicitly addresses this loneliness. Perhaps this was to guard against the inevitability of being alone in such emotionally taxing work as ministry. There seems to be a lack of communication felt, particularly regarding the stance of the church on topics pertaining to today's secular culture. One of the biggest discrepancies seems to be pertaining to sex, with most participants having an unclear understanding of what the church's perspective is about sex. One participant, despite spending a good chunk of our time talking about sex, stated that, "I think even talking about it makes me feel uncomfortable because I don't know what the church's position is, because I'm worried about judgment, because I worry about where God stands on it." Being unsure of the church's stance, and even being unsure of her own stance, was not unique to this participant. There's a certain search for a new norm, though it's unclear what that new norm might be. One participant stated that sex is a natural part of where we are when we're human, but the church is often taking the stance that most of that happens after marriage. Another comment was, "For me, it's like, don't ask, don't tell, and leave it between the two partners and what they want to make a decision about together that they think is loving and respectful to their beliefs." One participant summed up the struggle quite well. "I think sometimes that the whole, don't have sex until you're married or you're a terrible sinner, is not helpful. and then, oh, it's fun and it's loving, do what you like, is also maybe not helpful either. So where's the truth in the midst of that? And as you're trying to find the truth, what do you do or not do? And do you ever know what the truth is? It's hard waters to navigate. There was the discussion that although standards may be shifting for lay people, clergy are held to a different standard. One participant noted that, I think there's been more development in the church's perspective on sex, certainly at a lay level than maybe a clergy or upper hierarchy of the church are aware of. So I think it's maybe becoming more normalized than we might think. Another participant commented, I know we're held to a higher moral standard, but I can't figure out what that higher moral standard is. And that caused her to feel conflicted and to struggle. Another participant commented that there's kind of the sense of clergy being removed from the sexual field. Obviously, we all know that once you get married and, people have kids, but there's a sense that for clergy, sex is a necessary thing to have kids, rather than as a way of pleasure or as a way of connecting intimately with someone you love very much. Besides perceiving clergy to be held to a different standard, several issues seemed particular to this demographic, with one participant noting that there may be differences faced by different age groups, as many clergy I know are sexually active and are supportive of that, or a lot of people I know don't have that issue because they don't get ordained until they're 50-something and they're already married. Another issue that arose is that of living with someone before marriage, a practice that is quite common now in the secular world. One participant spoke to the desire that, I wish I could get to know what a person's like even more by living with them, which might not be a typical way of the past, but I've lived with other people as roommates and know the challenges that come with that. Many of the church's expectations regarding clergy sexual conduct come from biblical and historical contexts. In the honor-shame society of the ancient Middle East, a woman who did not adhere to these sexual ethics would risk dishonoring her family. The church regulated, and in some cases continues to regulate, these practices as a maintenance of their societal control and as a precautionary measure. Some have taken this to mean that marriage is meant to supersede singlehood as the fulfillment and completion of a person's life. For others, celibacy is seen to be the ultimate option, as we hear in 1 Corinthians. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is well for them to remain unmarried as I am. But if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. For some, neither option is palatable in the 21st century, hence the search for a new norm. So what does all of this mean? One of the biggest things that I have observed through this study is that there's a significant lack of space for singleness in the church. There's quite a bit of pressure on single clergy to get married. Each of my participants reported examples of times when comments had been made about when they were going to settle down, or with whom they should settle down, or that their clock was ticking, or that their congregants simply wanted them to be happy and settle down. This implies that ministers are incomplete if they are unmarried, or that there's something lacking in their life. This, combined with a person's fear of loneliness or being alone, can lead people to jump into hasty relationships. What might it look like to truly accept people as they are, and perhaps even see their singleness as a gift, rather than something that needs to be fixed? How can the church provide space for single people, whether lay or ordained? Can we redefine the idea of community in the church and allow space for single people to grow and flourish in healthy relation to others? Although peer support networks have arisen, particularly through online communities, there are minimal expectations or pertinent information regarding being a young, single clergywoman coming down from the church as a whole. By normalizing many of these experiences, or speaking openly about many of the topics I've addressed here today, the church may be able to better equip future clergywomen and may allow for more comfort in their roles and identities. Although not a requirement in any person's life, romantic relationships, or lack thereof, have an impact on the way in which a person interacts with others, including within the life of a clergy person and a congregation. While navigating the challenges and blessings of ministry, it may be worthwhile for young, single clergywomen to consider the theological implications of their personal choices and circumstances, as well as the effect current and historical theological trends have had on the vocational world in which they operate. Ultimately, it comes down to this. Think twice next time you want to ask someone, when are you going to settle down? Or when are you going to start a family? Worst case scenario, you make them feel inadequate, reminding them of a painful part of their life, one over which they wish they had more control. Best case scenario, their answer will be an excited, very soon, and you may begin to notice a shift in their priorities as they incorporate new people into their personal life. Neutral case, you're forcing them to answer a question they have repeated more times than they can count. Perhaps the better option may be to consider ways in which you can show your appreciation for them as they currently are, and skip this kind of question altogether. Thank you.
Great. Comments, questions, queries?
Thanks, Cate, for your presentation. A lot of what you said, even though I'm not a priest, as a single woman, I have experienced a lot of these things myself. And one of the things that I was thinking about was you talked a lot about loneliness. And I wondered whether we could see loneliness as being a gift in and of itself. A lot of people that come to church are there partly because they are lonely. And I wonder if we enter into that experience ourselves as single people and sit with it and not just kind of like wish it away, that might be a gift that we can give to other people that we're serving.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I've learned in my time here that people have a hard time sitting with sorrow or loneliness or the difficult emotions, and so often people kind of try to push those away or try to overcome them. But I think, kind of being in those moments of darkness or despair, if that's how you want to term it, but in those moments that are challenging, that can be, like you said, really a gift, and that can be something where you find strength and things like that. But yeah, I think so often in our society we kind of push those things aside and try and make everything happy and cheery and joyful. So not something I had considered, but thank you, that's very true.
Thanks for your presentation, Cate. It was wonderful. I think you've addressed an elephant in the room for a small but mighty group of folk listening to you. I was reading this morning that these presentations may well be on YouTube by the end of April, and I would reflect on and ask everybody who looks at these to spread the comments, to spread your presentation as wide as humanly possible using social media. There's a small group of people here, but what you've said needs to be heard by many, many folk.
Thank you.
Hi, Cate. Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. I'm a fraction concerned, just a fraction, that maybe you have too quickly slapped aside the the predominant position in the church for most of its history. Okay, and that's perfectly fine to slap it aside, but I'm interested in hearing why we slapped aside, because I'm sure there are reasons to slap it aside, which is why. And what I mean by this prominent position is, as you've suggested with both Corinthians, and we have it in Augustine, and we have it in Aquinas, and many others, the basic idea that all desire needs to be informed by the Holy Spirit in order for it to reach its proper end, rather than becoming disordered into self-aggrandizement, etc. And that this desire doesn't just zap us, zap, but we accept it, and that for them, marriage is a way of literally and formally accepting this desire. And so it's a sort of saying, okay, my sex life is going to be informed and pollinated by the Holy Spirit in a very, very formal way. And the church today still uses the same kind of rhetoric around things like ordination, but we completely, sort of slap it aside in terms of things like marriage and sexuality. And so is it possible that some of those concerned parishioners, maybe even without being able to express it, have a Thomistic or an Augustinian understanding of sex and sexuality, which sees it needing sacramental pollination in order to become all it can be, and without that, it may quickly dissolve into an economy of self-aggrandizement, etc. So just when we're slapping that aside, what are the reasons we slap it aside?
I think that's a very good question. Thank you. Ooh, apparently it's worthy of throwing things. So, yeah, I think a large part of it comes from what we see in secular culture and people wondering if the church can kind of catch up to what is seen in secular culture. And I would almost say that the church is like 30 or so years behind a lot of what happens in secular culture, maybe more, depending on who you talk to, because I'm seeing faces out there. But yeah, so it's not necessarily always lining up. And so I think it's not necessarily that we need to slap aside the traditions or the beliefs or the understanding of the past, but more so kind of considering why those are the beliefs and why those are the stances. And I think that essentially what we need is healthy conversation about these things. I know I myself personally don't know where I stand on a lot of these things. I'm taking sexual ethics with Dr. Faber for that exact reason. Hopefully by the beginning of April I can tell you where I stand. But yeah, I think really healthy conversation is kind of the important thing, and I wasn't intending to slap away everything that has existed before. Okay.
So I'm an old single lady. I'm in my first semester of doing my SFE, and my congregation there is very heavily invested in my appearance. And they've told me to change things, and I figured, well, why not respond? They want me to pull my hair back, and so that's fine. And they didn't like my glasses, and so actually that was a really great thing, because now I have new glasses and I can see so much better. That I really appreciate that. And last Sunday they told me that I looked 10 years younger in my alb. So I thought, well, can I wear my alb on a date? And then I thought, well, no, probably not. But it's interesting how invested a congregation is in your appearance, because it's your approachability. So when I went into my SFE side, I said, okay, I'm just gonna go with whatever and just try to be as responsive, because I'm really not too tied to whether my hair is pulled back or not. If it's good for them, why not? Why not change it? So, but yeah, the old ladies have the same problems as the young ladies too.
Yeah, a lot of these issues certainly aren't exclusive to young single clergywomen, but it's a group that's not often well documented, which is kind of why I wanted to do the research. But yeah, it's true, they apply to a lot of people.
Okay, thanks very much. As a preacher's kid, I can appreciate the fishbowl side of it, but that problem is even worse. The phrase that came to my mind as you were talking, as a former naval officer, is the loneliness of command. And a captain of a naval vessel is isolated from everyone else, doesn't even dine with the officers because of that loneliness of command. I realize this is quite different, but still, the clergy person is the spiritual leader of that group, and so there is that need for distance. And yet, as you say, in a rural community, what the heck does a young single woman do? My question then is, what can the church as an institution do to provide the support for these, especially the new clergy going out? How can the church as an institution help congregations to be educated? What sort of policies could be put in place? What sort of resources could be given? So that, for example, if I'm in a small rural congregation, we call a young woman, I've got something I can draw on to say, here's how we help you.
It's a good question, one that I've kind of thought of a lot myself, wondering what the answer to that might be. I think a lot of it is, part of it is naming it, to be honest, naming that it's not necessarily an easy thing, talking about these things, because some people don't necessarily realize that. And I mean, that kind of goes to a lot of things that I mentioned throughout the presentation. I mean, no one, when they're saying, oh, when are you going to settle down? They don't mean that in an unkind way. It comes from the heart, and it's because they want to see you be happy. But they don't realize kind of the underlying comment that's being made by that. So I think it's kind of similar in the sense that people may not realize how lonely it is, because oftentimes when congregation members see their clergy person, they're up at the front, they're smiling and talking and being friendly to people, or they're visiting them in their home. And so they may not realize the loneliness of that expectation and that role. And I think that's a really good comment that you made. I mean, that's a really great comparison yeah, thank you.
Hey, Kate. Great presentation, really fascinating. And I think the thing that stands out with me the most is what you said toward the beginning and then fleshed out for the next 30 minutes, is that these young women are finding themselves in two worlds. You said the world of their peers and the world of the church. I kind of, and then you went on to kind of talk about the world of society and church. I like that language better. And I think, isn't that the walk of faith for all of us? Is to learn to live in both worlds. And they're feeling it in a particular way as young clergywomen. Was there any response from them or sense that you got that they could then use that to channel, you know, how really all people of faith are trying to walk that double life and navigate that reality of two worlds?
I wouldn't say that came up in any of the interviews. I think it's something that people are aware of, but may not have put into those words exactly. But I think that's a really good point, that, I mean, being a Christian in general, as I think David was saying yesterday, is not always easy. And so much of what we do is kind of being in the world but not of the world, to put it biblically. Yeah, so I think that there really would be an excellent opportunity to mesh those two and to be able to express that to anyone who is a Christian or a religious person in general, that walking the line of secular culture and religious culture, they don't always mesh. So yeah, it didn't come up in the interviews, but I think it's a really good point. Thank you.
Hi, Kate. So in my own contemplation of the single life, a number of years ago, I came across an analogy that I think was taken from the early Irish church about 3 ways of pilgrimage through the earthly life. And there were 3 ways of martyrdom. There was the red martyrdom, which is being killed for your faith. The green martyrdom, which was the working out of one's salvation through sort of like ordinary time, which I think back then would have just been seen as like marriage and family and the deaths and life and tragedy that goes through time. And then the white martyrdom, which was the celibate life, and was usually embodied through the monastic tradition. But all 3 were seen as ways of pilgrimage, as a way. And all 3 were valued. And there's different gifts and a different sort of logic that extends through each way. And I just was wondering do you think if we could recover some of an understanding of celibacy, whether chosen or unchosen, or the single state as a way of transformation and salvation like any other way, if that would be something that would be helpful to those who are in this state?
I think that could definitely open up a different sense of understanding for a lot of folks, and maybe may help people to better understand where they're at those different times, because it can be a gift, as you said, or a pathway. And I think it's something that we don't speak about enough. Again, I guess I'm just really encouraging talk about all these things, but it's something that's not mentioned enough, and that could be really helpful for people to hear more about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Thinking about a very popular New York Times opinion piece last year that came out, in which the author suggested that the way we go about looking for a life partner is completely backward, in the sense that we present ourselves in the best possible light and we hide away the worst parts of ourselves. And it's not until much later, when maybe it's too late, that the ugly stuff comes to the surface. So I was thinking about that in terms of dating apps, how that provided a way to bring out the stuff up front. But you would also think maybe that a person trained in pastoral outreach might be better equipped to confront that in the first date experience, to open up that conversation and probably away with that stuff. Did you experience that maybe people are not very good at administering to themselves or bringing their pastoral experience into personal situations? Or is there any way you can inform that?
Thank you. I don't think that came up in my research per se. I think most of my participants kind of separated the two a fair amount, more so than kind of bringing them together. So it wasn't necessarily like, I'm a minister and I'm going to tell you all about what it's like to be a minister on a first date, but more so kind of, like one participant mentioned, kind of trying to break those things down so that they could get to what other people can talk about, and the general pop culture kind of things. But I think that it could be really beneficial to bring those experiences in, even if it's not necessarily like, let me tell you a day in the life of a minister, but it could be the ways in which you listen to someone and the ways in which you ask deeper questions, and things like that. But wasn't something that came up in my research, but good thought.
I was thinking more in terms of sharing, for instance, these are the ways in which I'm damaged.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, that definitely didn't come up. Yeah, that takes an extreme amount of vulnerability. But that'd be really cool if people did that. Like, it'd be intense, but yeah. Yeah. I will say, I don't know if we're supposed to talk about personal things, but I'm going to say it anyway. I recently went on a kind of awkward first date, and we actually ended up talking about death and grieving and all these different things, and kind of said, you know, it's not the norm to talk about on a first date, but this was someone who was quite religious themselves, and then I guess the conversation just kind of migrated that way. But we didn't get into the whole, like, here's all my problems, but so it can come out that way, I guess.
Hi, Kate.
Hi.
I have two questions, but they're not very intense, so that's okay.
Thank you.
The first one is, I just wonder if there was any conversation in your interviews about appropriateness in terms of timing or whatnot around introducing a new person to a congregation that a clergy person is dating or in a relationship with. And the second question is, I don't know how big your sample size was, but I just wondered if there were differences in the experience of your interviewees based on their sexuality.
Thank you. So to address the first one, in terms of timing, that was something that came up with a few participants, and they sort of wondered, you know, one person kind of said, I don't want my congregation to necessarily know that I'm seeing someone, because they had just started a new relationship, because they said basically they don't want the congregation to get too attached if the person's not going to be around. And that was something that I found in the research that I did as well, is that there's a big question about kind of how do you do that, because it does sort of go back to that vulnerability Ken was mentioning about, you know, you want to be as vulnerable and open with your congregation as you can, but at the same time there are those boundaries. And so essentially the participants that spoke about it said, I don't know the answer to this, I'm hoping you can tell me. And I'm like, I don't know either, I'll hopefully find out. So that was something that came up but was not solidly decided on, or yeah, so there was a big question on that. And then in terms of sexuality, I intentionally kept it all as men for the presentation so as not to identify people by their gender preferences. Like they were all women, but some of them did date women. One person in particular talked about the journey of coming out when she was in ministry, and she spent her first 2 years, I think, dating men, and then came to a point where she realized more about who she was and kind of became more comfortable with her own identity and started dating women. And she was saying how difficult it is because it's almost like you have to come out every time you introduce your partner to someone, because the congregation knew her in one way, and then she really was facing this new reality and was kind of trying to figure out how to deal with that. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Hi, Kate.
Hi.
Well done. Thank you. I couldn't help but think a little bit in relation to David's question earlier about kind of what the church can do for these folks. I have a wonderful book at home that I picked up at a yard sale or some antique bookstore that the United Church put out back in the 50s on how to lead a couples club. On how the wonderful images and fun things for single people of the 50s to do, and how to like get people in relationships, essentially, right? And I know at least in the United Church this was a big thing, kind of a generation ago, of churches, because of the baby boomers and because of post-war things. There were just lots of people around in that age group at that time. Mm-hmm. I recognize that our generation isn't quite the same, but I wonder if, I guess you just have any general comments about kind of maybe the value of those sorts of things, or maybe that might be more of a hindrance. I don't know what the Anglican tradition has been around trying to kind of set up date nights in the church, or like whatever, couples clubs, or whatever you want to call it, right? But sometimes these are well-intentioned things that don't always work out. As you mentioned earlier, congregants just want clergy to be happy, or single people to be happy and in relationships. But sometimes there might also be a benefit of intentionally saying, okay, we have this single community, let's just set up something for people to meet and greet.
Thank you. I think it's a great opportunity, but to be undertaken with a fair amount of caution. So often in churches, once you kind of graduate high school, there's nothing for you until you get married and you're doing marriage prep, or have children, whichever order that comes in. And so there's this great space where there's kind of no clear notion of what people should do or to do with their times or any sort of programming or anything. The struggle becomes how much of that works, I guess, and how much of it becomes, like you said, a hindrance. And oftentimes, I think, when these sorts of things happen, the people that show up are typically, in my experience, straight women. And then you have a group of straight women who can offer support to each other, which is fantastic, but it doesn't work for the like matchmaking thing. It kind of sounded like you were suggesting. And yeah, I think it kind of can also add to the whole idea of like forcing people into relationships rather than kind of accepting them in their singleness. So it would depend on how people went about that, I think. Does that answer your question enough? Thank you.
I just have a few comments. One relates to a theme that I'm hearing, and that might relate to just the struggle that these young women experience, and that is that the sense that Christian vocation isn't something divisible into private and public. So it's not the kind of question you could ask, where does my professional life end and my private life begin? There's a sense that there's a kind of continuity between those. The other thing is you kind of suggested that in April maybe you might have answers. And I would actually hope that you don't. One of the things that we've discussed in the sexual ethics class is much as you talked about sitting with loneliness and our difficulty in sitting with grief, there's also the difficulty of sitting with uncertainty.
Yes.
And it, as I would attest in my own sort of muddled life, in sexual ethics, it is something that can take a very, very long time to work out. You don't know, and there are ethicists who say that it's an ethical capacity to not know what to do. To not know what to do for a very long time. And Martha Nussbaum, another ethicist in the virtue ethics line, basically said our capacity for surprise and bewilderment are really critical. And I think it's so critical in this conversation too, like just hearing people's stories and making mistakes and saying, well, you know, that really didn't work. That's really how our sexual lives progress, isn't it? Is trying things out and saying, well, I really screwed up that one, and pun not intended. And so we muddle along somehow. And so answers might not be what we're in search for, but maybe more capacity for uncertainty and not knowing what to do, and realizing that you're on new terrain and you have all the, like, so many challenges of being in the limelight at the same time while you do this. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. That was really very good. A couple of observations. I would suggest that some of the things that you were talking about are experienced by younger people and people of all ages, I suppose, who want to live a particular life of virtue or value or goodness, or however we want to understand that. So I've heard many of the similar kinds of comments that you referred to from colleagues in my workplace. Doctors, nurses, technicians, everyone. There are many people who aren't interested necessarily in sex, drugs, and rock and roll right off the bat. I really would echo what the gentleman who outed himself as a retired naval officer said. That's a really excellent, and I would suggest a helpful analogy to make, to differentiate between, well, just to understand that, and in time come to accept that there is a certain loneliness in command, and that set apartness has its value, and sometimes it has its downside. And I think it was you who used the phrase "in but not of." That's such a difficult walk to make, as Alida just suggested, but it's a journey so worth making. And so, as a relatively old woman, although I must say a younger woman here than I am in my workplace, kind of a nice change, I must say. The journey really is worth the struggle, and if we can find a way in ourselves to differentiate between aloneness and loneliness, which I would argue are not the same, is a really valuable life lesson that will see, I would suggest, a single woman of any age, generation, occupation, or vocation through a whole lot of societally and personally induced grief. So good luck and have fun.
Thank you.
Hi, Cate. A comment on the loneliness. Susan McKell-Punt-Gillis was over there a few minutes ago, but she's gone now. But in one of her SFA classes, she talked about that. And talked about the absolute importance of having a group of like people. So, you know, friends that you've been close with through seminary, friends that you have in the church, people that you can talk to and lean on when you are in fact lonely. Because regardless of if you're married or if you're single, we all experience loneliness at some times. And other ministers are going to be able to understand what you're going through. So Susan suggested that it was very important to try to get 4 or 5 people that you can pull on, count on, and know they're going to be there. So that should help. The other thing, though, that I wanted to ask you about was every single person I know, single in ministry, has been asked the question way too often on dates, are you allowed to have sex? Did that come up in your study?
Yeah, definitely. A few participants talked about, that's sort of some of the things they were saying when you're breaking down the expectations that people have. One of the things you can say is I'm allowed to have sex, I'm allowed to drink sometimes, I'm allowed to swear. One of the participants was particularly vocal about those things, and really sort of said, there is differentiation obviously between the secular and religious worlds, but there's not necessarily as much differentiation, and a lot of times people put clergy up on a pedestal, which kind of comes out in the whole clergy held to a different moral standard thing, whereas really all Christians should be held to the same moral standard, not putting some clergy up there and everyone else down there. So that definitely came up.
Okay, thank you.
We'll take one more question. 2 more questions, sorry. A mom gets to call the last question.
I was like, Mom's asking a question.
Mom, she has a question.
Uh-oh. She knows too much.
Thank you, Cate. Great presentation, great topic. I wonder if it came up in your research or in your participant interviews. Was it more about sex or was it more about intimacy? And was there an overlap of that, or was it more predominantly sex or more predominantly intimacy? That was that question.
Definitely intimacy. That came up quite a bit, and there were some people who talked about the sex side of things too and wanting that, but all of it was underlined by wanting that intimacy and wanting someone to share both the joys and the struggles with, someone to support them, to kind of walk through this journey with them and to know them in deeper ways than a lot of their congregants can, because you can't, as much as vulnerability is a great thing, you can't go and pour everything out to your congregation. So having someone that can be that support and having that intimacy with that person was the real underlying thing of it, and kind of sex was on the side of that, but still seen as important and valued, but it was definitely the intimacy. Hi, Mom.
Really good job, darling. Actually, mine's not going to be a question, it's a comment. Just to remind you, as you're going to have your first, what do you call the house where you live in?
Rectory.
Thank you, rectory. You can have your 2 cats now. So you won't be
so
lonely.
I won't be lonely.
Exactly.
I'll be a crazy cat lady. Awesome.
2 cats.
Thanks, Mom. Nice way to end it.
Wow, that's a really great way to segue out of that one, isn't it? Yeah. 3 cats makes you cat lady.
That's what I hear.
Anyhow.
You're allowed to have 2 cats per person that lives in the house. After that, it's crazy cat lady status. So. No.
27 cats, we got a big problem. Okay. Yeah, then you move out of the rectory because they have to tear it down. Wow, really fascinating. We could spend a lot of time on this. It clearly hit an incredible edge for a lot of people. And Ron and I are here, so Ron and I are about the same time of ordination, and we're about the same age, and Rama's in Newfoundland, and I'm Nova Scotia at the time of our ordinations. And how many of our colleagues got married in the first congregation, right? Guys. Yeah. Married the organist, which is just an extra bonus. But boy, oh boy. Yeah.
Well, I didn't ask a question because I wanted to intimidate. But one of the things I was reflecting on in terms of much of what you said, reflecting on the current experiences, is that really wasn't a whole lot different for me 35 years ago as a single male in the rural congregation. Hold on, well, societal shift, yes, has changed. But I think that balancing who you are as an individual within the broader culture and within the call to ministry, yeah. And as
Uh-oh.
Oh, that's a little scary.
Coming from your bishop, yes.
But I'll just tell you quickly about a quick story, and then we'll move right to 4 things. Get the evaluations, really important. That's one. That's the other way we'll do that. And we'll do grace in a second. But so I was ordained in 1981. and I was a single guy in ministry. But the really interesting thing is the number of sexually related or relationally related or intimacy related questions that I received as a priest. And I avoided sex issues when I was a theological student. Well, even in those days, we didn't even talk about it, right? We defer back to, say, celibacy is the only option. But in 1985, I did a CPE unit because I knew I was so illiterate. And in that CPE unit, I made sexuality the primary focus of my exploration. And in those days, for people who live in Halifax, the only kind of esoteric bookstore was Red Herring. Do you remember Red Herring bookstore? So I went down because it actually had a women's section. This is International Women's Day. It had a women's section, right? So I went over to the proprietor of the store, and I asked for the men's section. I said, "Do you have a men's section?" And he said, "We don't sell those kind of books." We've come a long way, and we've got Venus Envy, and we've got now male sections in bookshops and female sections, and we're pushing the science and the intimacy and the questions. And I think it's incumbent upon the church to be on the vanguard of that. Not sitting back and saying we're trying to catch up with the society, but in fact, we want to be in front of that society. We want to be naming realities, bringing things into view, whether it's loneliness and the existential reality of loneliness, or whether it's the existential reality of just intimacy and closeness, and having conversations that are life-giving for people. If that's what church is about, then we're doing something really exciting. And if that's what we're about, then Cate took us there today. Well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.